all the great theists who were the early founders of modern science, Boyle, Kepler, Newton, believed that nature was intelligible and could be understood by the human mind because the design in nature issued from the same intelligence, namely God, who made our minds
in his likeness,
so that we could understand nature.
It's a hell of an argument.
Why does the reason within mathematics that we develop on the basis of our deductive reasoning match and describe precisely the reason that is built into the universe, the design of the universe? He says the best explanation for that is, again, theism.
Well, I think for what it's worth, you make a hell of an argument to me. I've been romanced.
There's a lot of brilliant minds out there that can prove God's existence, and one of them is Stephan Meyer. He was on a show with an atheist, and the host actually ended up becoming warm and welcoming to Stephan Meyer's message. Let's all watch and enjoy as Stephan Meyer portrays the truth of God by declaring that mathematics was discovered and not invented, as well as some of his personal life experiences that got him to this point. I think you're going to be really interested in it. Let's jump right in.
There were two leading mathematicians there, one from Oxford, John Lennox, whose name I can share in this context, who told me that the other mathematician there was 2 league tables above him in the hierarchy of great mathematicians, one of the top 3 guys in the world, maybe.
Wow.
And anyway, this other mathematician, whose name I'm not going to reveal yet, but can in a year or so when he comes out with a book that we're going to be publishing, he took me aside and said, I love your new book, Return to the God Hypothesis. He said, my wife's an agnostic, but after reading it, she's going wobbly, he said.
Wow!
But he said, I have a beef with you. He said, you got 3 the 3 discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. He says, there's one more. It's math. And I had just read a long essay that he had written, and I kind of knew where he was going with this, but he starts to explain. He says, all mathematicians are basically mathematical Platonists. They believe mathematical structures, equations, mathematical objects, as the mathematicians call them, circles, geometric forms, have an objective reality. A circle has all the same properties to every geometer, irrespective of their preference. We're not
their language, their location on the earth.
The quadratic equation or differential equations, they have certain properties, and they are stable, and they are mind independent. And yet they are independent of our perceptions, but they are conceptual. They are not physical, they are not material. So they're objective, they're conceptual, but they do not, but mathematicians believe they are discovered, not invented, because they have a reality independent of ours. Well, if they're
that's one of the great ideas of philosophy, right. Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That reality exists, whether you're here or not, whether the firmament is here, it doesn't matter. That's a reality.
So if they're conceptual, meaning mental, and they're independent of our perceptions, in whose mind do they exist? And this mathematician, writing a book on this with our colleague David Berlinski, says this seems to point
deep shit
towards an immaterial mind, towards theism. And so
Michael,
you missed
that's a number 3 mathematician in the world,
missed something,
Michael.
Meyer. He said it should be four things that reveal.
That's so cool, though. What an endorsement.
Let's see what numbers 1 and 2 think of that.
Son of a bitch. Son of a bitch. He had to get the number 1 and number 2.
Well, because, but again, how does science work? It's very much a collective social enterprise of trying to convince your colleagues that you've got something worth listening to and that you have evidence for it.
Sure.
And if you don't, well, that's just the way it goes. I mean, I get letters all the time from people that, that they have an alternative theory of physics too. There's hundreds of them, but most of them.
This isn't an alternative theory of math. This is a.
Oh, I understand.
This is a question of philosophy of mathematics,
yeah.
And it happens that most mathematicians are mathematical Platonists. They recognize this objectivity and immateriality of mathematical objects, and that raises a question: if something's conceptual, in which mind does it reside? If it doesn't reside in ours,
in the template in the sky, and that would be God.
Well, okay, so
that would be Yahweh.
I mean, so take some basic laws of nature, like when a star gets to a certain temperature, it fuses hydrogen into helium, and you can describe this with math. All right, but where is that description? I mean, where's the math existing? I mean, it's not in the star; it's where? I mean, it's in somebody's mind describing, but the process is actually happening. It's out there.
It's separate from us, isn't it?
But we use words to describe it, or we have equations to describe it. Where are those? This is a hard problem.
It's a great question, and it's one of the reasons that I think quantum cosmology, the alternative to a straight-up Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, has its own theistic implications. Quantum cosmology does, because the explanans, the thing doing the explaining in quantum cosmology, is a mathematical function called a universal wave function, and an apparatus that stands behind that called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation and superspace. There's this whole mathematical apparatus that pre-exists the universe, the physical universe, and the physical universe is explained as a consequence of the mathematics that pre-exists the universe. Now, the people, the guys at the forefront of this, not the popularizers, but people like Vilenkin, have said, wait a minute, doesn't that imply then, aren't we then saying, maybe we don't want to be saying this, maybe inadvertently we're saying this, but doesn't that imply that there's a mind behind the universe? And Hawking himself tumbled to this uncomfortable realization. He said, what is it that puts fire in the equations that gives them a universe to describe? And what he's saying, he's building off of what Michael just said, is that math by itself has no, it's causally inert. It doesn't, it's
just there.
Conceptual. It's not a physical thing that causes other physical things to happen.
Yes, it is.
So,
but I mean, there are theoretical theorems that later on, so somebody writes a theorem, somebody dedicates his life to a theorem, they die at 85. 100 years later, somebody pulls that off the shelf.
Well,
use to measure
that
X,
is
Y, and Z.
This mathematician that I was talking about.
I mean, that's incredible.
This is what his essay was about: is this the unreasonable applicability of mathematics to the physical world? Quantum mechanics was developed. The mathematics of complex variables was developed long before it had any application on the basis of pure deductions, mathematical deductions from first principles, and then 100 years later, so it turns out to be absolutely critical to doing quantum mechanics. And there are many, many examples of this in the history of physics. What is it that why does John Polkinghorne, the great Cambridge physicist, used to say, why does the reason within the mathematics that we develop on the basis of our deductive reasoning match and describe precisely the reason that is built into the universe, the design of the universe? He says the best explanation for that is, again, theism.
Yeah, so this idea that math existed before the foundation of the universe and that we are discovering it is actually held by a lot of creationists, but scientists themselves say that without me and you existing, math still exists. The things that hold math together, the actual foundational principles of what numbers are, and addition and subtraction and division, multiplication, exist without our consciousness. We weren't the first to think about it, but it exists within a consciousness, which would be God. I think it's a really interesting point that Stephan Meyer brings up here, and that's why the host agrees with him. So let's just continue watching, and I'll come back in with my thoughts later.
It provides a principle of correspondence that the same God who made the design, the rationality, the orderly patterns we see in nature, made our minds in such a way to discern the mathematical structure that is inherent in those systems, and that's why we can do science. And actually, that principle of correspondence was one of the key things that inspired the scientific revolution. It was called the principle of intelligibility. And all the great theists who were the early founders of modern science, Boyle, Kepler, Newton, believed that nature was intelligible and could be understood by the human mind because the design in nature issued from the same intelligence, namely God, who made our minds
in his likeness,
so that we could understand nature.
It's a hell of an argument. I mean,
although I should point out since I
can
mentioned,
feel Michael's skepticism.
You mentioned Max Tegmark before. He deals with the same problems and does not come to the theistic conclusion at all.
Well,
he's always got to bring the spoil sport into the party.
Well, what Tegmark does is says that every mathematical structure that's logically possible must exist in some possible world. And
I'm not. But my point was this: I'm not.
And Michael and I are both skeptical about that.
I don't know.
That does nothing to undermine
the point is that
argument.
it's not necessarily the right induction to the best explanation. Theism. I mean, it could be that we're just going to hit an epistemological wall where we just can't know, like what was there before the Big Bang, what was there before time began. Again, Hawking's analogy: what's north of the North Pole? How does something come from nothing? Well, what do you mean by nothing? Well, not only just no matter, space, time, energy, but no logic, no ideas, no gods, nothing. No eternity.
No laws of physics, Lawrence Krauss. Sorry, you're cheating.
Nothing. I mean, you wouldn't even have no thing. I mean, the word itself, no thing, implies there's a thing that doesn't exist. True nothing wouldn't even be that. There's no eternity because there's no time. At some point, I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Right.
These words are just like, well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I think for what it's worth, you make a hell of an argument to me. I've been romanced.
Damn, I was going to get you some flowers.
Michael still
take you out to dinner.
He still holds firm. I know. I'm a soft touch.
It's always a great iron sharpening iron conversation with Michael.
You guys are great. Yeah, it's great.
I always feel, first of all, I always enjoy the interactions with him, but I always feel like anybody who has interest in these deep questions, irrespective of what side of the argument they're on, it's to me a friend and a colleague, a kindred spirit.
Yeah.
Because, there's a lot of people that just go through life, just don't want to think about it.
They're not interested in the questions.
And that's to me, just not the unexamined life is not worth living, said Socrates. I kind of agree with him on that.
I'm right with you on that.
Yeah.
Well, and if you're right, I guess I'll find out.
Yeah, you will.
And I'm kind of hoping, that God will go, hey, at least Shermer gave it a shot. We'll let him in.
Well, yeah, Michael. I mean, what I love about you is that you're always interested in the truth, and you're tireless in asking the right questions and pushing back, and you live a moral life. I mean, just being a moral objectivist is to me, whether we all slip up here and there, but for the most part, there is scaffolding.
He puts out a fine magazine too.
Skeptic is a great magazine.
A lot of the stuff that he's skeptical about, I'm skeptical about.
Skeptic is a great magazine.
ID colleagues are as well.
Thank you.
Well, your magazine is very important, especially now when everybody's coming up with their own truth. My final
crisis in our culture is crisis of authority.
Well, there's nobody can even agree on where
people
the
skeptical
origins.
about people overstating certainty about science, but then that means that then people just are throwing babies out with bathwater.
Right.
And we got to find a happy medium
That's
here
exactly
where we learn to evaluate scientific claims and keep the debate open, but also we have to respect people that have done the hard work to come to some conclusions that are necessary for us to live our lives.
Objective truth.
Yeah,
exactly. Are you religious at all?
I am personally religious. I'm a Christian. Like sometimes say denominationally confused Christian, but I'm also attracted.
Why Christianity?
I believe that there is evidence in support of the reliability of the New Testament, and I think there's evidence actually of a design to the Bible that's quite compelling, that makes it self-authenticating as an unusual source of truth, and I'm very compelled by the person of Jesus Christ. I think he's for reasons that you stated.
I want to ask my question that I ask everybody on this particular question. Yeah. Why don't Jews believe this? They believe in the same God, the same book, at least the Old Testament. They know all the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb and Mary and the apparitions, the whole thing, the eyewitnesses and so on. They don't accept it. Why is that? You can't say, well, if they understood the arguments, they'd accept the resurrection of Jesus.
My answer would be one of the great strengths of the Jews is their endless capacity for debate, and the idea of you could show you could show a room full of rabbis a miracle, and all of them would be like, but how can we be sure of that? And how do we know I'm not being tricked? And I think that part of progress is always saying, I'm not really going to rely on what I've been told. I'm going to find out for myself.
Well, but I asked Ben Shapiro this on his show. He's Jewish, and he goes, well, because the Old Testament did not predict that that's who would come, that the carpenter from Nazareth, that it would be a warrior, not a peacemaker, and so he had his arguments based on Old Testament. Okay, so why doesn't if he listened to your arguments, would he become a Christian?
I think it's well beyond the scope of this discussion to get into the case for Christianity one way or another. But I would say your retort, your question, is a kind of ad hominem, in not in the sense it's an insult, but it's really trying to base the truth based on what one person or another does or doesn't believe. And I think to really evaluate the question, you have to look at the evidence itself. I will say there is an interesting contemporary phenomenon, which is that there are more and more ethnically Jewish people who are adopting Christianity by belief. Now, I have very close Orthodox Jewish friends, very close conservative Jewish friends, very close secular Jewish friends. My friend Berlinski invites people of all those persuasions and people, Gentile academics. We do a conference most years in Europe. Last year we had, I think, 13 Jewish scientists and scholars. 5 of them were Christian by belief, underscoring the old maxim, two Jews, 3 opinions.
Right,
I don't think it's as simple as all Jews reject or all Jews accept. And in any case,
I don't think you can tell. He was a rabbi.
I don't think you can tell. You can't tell the truth about any proposition by simply counting heads about who does or doesn't believe it. I think you got to get into the evidence, and you got to apply the Bayesian type analysis.
Is there a book or is there an argument that swayed you? Because you said that there was about the New Testament. There was.
My story is that for all these scientific arguments that I've been making, the thing that deeply persuaded me, first of theism and eventually of Christianity, were more philosophical types of arguments or perceptions. I had an existential crisis as a 14-year-old. It's a little embarrassing, but I had questions that I later learned the French existentialist philosophers were asking, and I didn't know where they were coming from. I just thought it meant something was wrong with me. And so I had a period in my early adolescence where I was afraid I was going insane, because I was asking questions like, what's it going to matter in 100 years? I couldn't imagine anything that I did in my daily routine that would have any lasting value. I read a book about baseball and all my heroes and, the history of baseball. And, when they got to 40 years old, they had their records. And then what? I mean, what was the point? Eventually there's just going to be some numbers on a piece of paper. And I kept thinking, well, but what's the point of anything I might accomplish? And later in college, I was taking a course on existentialism and came across this passage in Sartre where he says, without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting or enduring meaning. Well, that's just axiomatic. And so that sense that all of us have that, when we die, we rot, and then what did it all mean? I think it was a haunting thing for me as a teenager. And then I started thinking about time, and I couldn't make sense of that. And so I was a mess. And I started reading the big fat Catholic family Bible. We were nominally Catholic, hardly ever went to church. And as I started reading it, first of all, I was compelled by the figure of Jesus Christ. I for the sort of reasons you were describing, and it's just an extraordinary person. But then there were passages in the Bible that spoke to these deeper philosophical questions that I had. I had this intuitive sense that there must be something that didn't change. We live in this world, the ephemeral nature of our sense perceptions. I hold up this water bottle, I drop it to the table. I can remember now that event from 3 seconds ago, but it's permanently gone. And where did it go? And I had this sense there must be something that doesn't change, or else all this constant flux of the empirical sense perceptions of the world floating by me is ultimately meaningless. There's got to be some grounding. And I can't prove that even now speaking, but it was this deep intuitive sense I had. And then I came across passages in the Bible like, Yahweh revealing himself to Moses at the burning bush and revealing that his name was the I am that I am, or in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I thought, this is worth investigating, because if these claims are true, some of these haunting philosophical questions and I didn't really know they were philosophical questions until I got to college. I had a professor, when I was taking the course in existentialism, I said, oh, I wasn't insane. I said, I was just a philosopher. And the prof says, yeah, but there's a fine line between philosophy and insanity.
You're damn right there is.
Be careful. Anyway, sorry to go on about the
I
personal
appreciate
stuff.
It.
But
for
me, it was a long, I didn't have a Damascus Road conversion. It was a long period of
more intellectual.
Yeah.
And so that was Stephan Meyer, and I actually find his childhood story very interesting. He said he had like an existential crisis when he was 15, and I can kind of relate to that. He is one of the top, philosophical, one of the most brilliant minds when talking about God and Jesus, and the way that he lays out this philosophical argument about mathematics existing before everything is amazing. I actually have the verse that he brought up, which was, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. We as Christians have nothing to fear when we look into science or truth, because really, as we search truth, it all leads back to him. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to watch more Christian encouragement videos and faith videos, check out my channel. This was Chief Messenger, delivering you some awesome testimony as well as some brilliant proofs for God. Have a great day.